evening from the News Radio 1120 and 93.7 FM KPNW studios. I'm Bill London, and I have bad hair. I do the wake-up call 6 a.m. to 9 on KPNW, streaming worldwide at kpnw.com. And your Crazy Oregon News is brought to you by Sean Sutherland. Now, you may have questions, particularly about Medicaid, maybe Medicare, or just about insurance in general. Well, then you need to just ask Insurance, and in particular, Sean Sutherland. He is, in a lot of ways, kind of like Superman, except he doesn't have really super strength and can't fly. I met him once. He doesn't wear his underwear outside of his pants, at least not in public. Okay, bad analogy. But when you do have questions about insurance, there is a guy who's more than willing to go out and give you an answer. So just ask Insurance and Sean Sutherland. All right, so there's kind of a theme here and some, if you will, significant juxtaposition for those of you that actually remember something from, I think, 10th grade lit class. So Oregon's unemployment rate crept up 4.7% in Oregon in April. And while the U.S. unemployment rate was hovering at 4.2%. So the job losses in Oregon were the largest in transportation, warehousing, and utilities, and construction employment continued its two-year downward trend. As a matter of fact, unemployment in Oregon has been increasing every month for the last year. Now, Oregon also fell 44th in Chief Executive's Best and Worst State for Business ranking. Yes, we're number 44. We need to get those foam hands with 44 fingers. Oregon's 2025 ranking was a place lower than it was last year. Oh, we can make it to number 50. Oregon now ranks higher than only Washington, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Illinois, New York, and California. And that ranking is based, at least as far as chief executive goes, on state-level policy stability, taxation, regulatory climate, and the availability of talented employees. Oregon's decline further into the survey's bottom 10 states for business really isn't surprising. Also, last year, Oregon dropped 7 places in CNBC's annual America's Top States for Doing Business ranking. Oregon actually ranked near the bottom of the ranking for CNBC for business friendliness, besting only New York and New Jersey. Now, if you think back and ask yourself, why might this be? On April 23rd, we told you about multiple economists in the Oregon legislature discussing the state's economic problems during a sobering hearing that was held by the Senate Committee on Labor and Business. That hearing, as we reported a month ago, the University of Oregon and the Institute for Policy Research and Engagement survey was actually discussed quite at length. And it went out and surveyed hundreds of state businesses. Now, of those that responded to the survey, and there were hundreds of them, 24% reported being approached by recruiting agencies outside of Oregon. And of that 24%, an astounding 68% reported moving or expanding outside of Oregon. As a result, the report notes the state, Oregon, has lost thousands of jobs, potential jobs, and billions of dollars of private investments in the past 5 years, and it's poised to lose even more over the next 5 years. The report highlighted a number of factors being the top drivers that is causing the problems here in Oregon, at least as far as businesses are concerned. And its anti-business regulatory climate is one of them, along with high taxes for businesses and employees, Oregon's poor education system, along with crime and social issues, including the state's inability or lack of desire to deal with homelessness and drugs. And all of this kind of brings us to the big part of the point. With the legislature here in Oregon dealing with big monetary asks from schools, the Oregon Department of Transportation, the Oregon Department of Forestry, from the governor for homeless and mental health programs, from other agencies, from cities and counties. Elected officials received some really bad news this week. They're going to have a lot less money to work with than they expected. The state's revenue forecast, which was released Wednesday afternoon, shows a $755 million dip in available resources. Now, lawmakers are going to use that reality to finalize the state's 2025 through 27 biennium budget. General fund dollars are down 2% from a revenue forecast released in February, and the drop mainly due to a nearly $500 million decline in projected personal income taxes. Why is that? Well, we've already sort of talked about it. Declining employment rates, declining wage growth, as well as uncertainty over government regulations by businesses. Oregon's chief economist, Carl Riccadonna, says that while he doesn't see a recession, he does see a prolonged period of nearly stagnant economic growth. And that, of course, impacts corporate and business income taxes. It also affects, of course, employment. It actually goes to the bottom line of the state's general fund. Now, Riccadonna expects national economic growth this year to decrease from 2% to 0.8%. Now, state Democrats immediately blamed federal uncertainty for the decline, and most of them are blaming it on President Trump's policies. But Republican Senate Minority Leader Daniel Bonham said in a statement, instead of addressing our own failures, they deflect to D.C. while pushing policies that drive jobs and investments out. We kind of outlined some of that. He also says Oregon's anti-business climate, high taxes, and housing restrictions, especially over the last 6 years, along with the hidden sales tax, that, by the way, is Oregon's corporate activities tax on businesses, and he added Portland's layered income-based taxes are strangling opportunity and finances here in the state. Now, let's talk about one of those agencies that's looking for big money, and that would be the Oregon Department of Transportation. And they are begging the legislature for a massive pile of taxpayer dollars, and now they're facing new criticism from the legislature over a long-running over-budget project in Portland. That is the so-called I-5 Rose Quarter Improvement Project. Now, ODOT says currently that it's going to cost a little over $2 billion. A year ago, their estimate was $1.5 billion that was actually supposed to be paid for and done by now with a 2017 mega spending package. So this latest estimate is a sizable increase from the last estimate, which was actually a sizable increase from the estimate before that. That acknowledgement drew some pretty scathing comments from the Oregon Transportation Commissioners during a hearing. Julie Brown, chair of the Oregon Transportation Committee, said, quote, "We have a credibility problem right now." Indeed. The department is trying to convince the legislature to approve billions of dollars in additional taxpayer money for highway mega projects like the one we just mentioned, and with it, proposals to create 11 new taxes and increased fees on Oregon taxpayers to fund ODOT's continued bloat. In response to the new numbers on the project, OTC Commissioner Alicia Chapman, seeing the obvious trend of ever-growing cost estimates from ODOT on the Rose Quarter project, said, quote, "We actually need to have a plan for a $2.5 billion project." She said, "I just want to be really blunt about that because we keep having these optimistic estimates." Oregon used to send children in foster care out of state, a practice that led to abuse of those children. In cases that we've reported and have been reported actually nationally, kids were sent out of state and chained to beds and drugged. And it cost the state millions of dollars in legal settlements and lawsuits. Well, we stopped doing that. Now the state, and in particular the Department of Human Services, wants to do it again, and Governor Tina Kotek says she's behind the plan. And that would be done by House Bill 3835, which would not only allow, once again, the state to send kids away, but also would loosen the definition of what are called restraining devices for children. And by loosening the definition, what I mean is it would take restraint devices that are considered to be illegal now and make them legal. What could go wrong? The House and Senate chairs of the Human Services Committees actually oppose the measure. Opponents have said the policy changes will ultimately offer fewer protections and will mean, once again, more children are harmed. Oregon's pharmacy access crisis is now a full-blown emergency, with Oregon ranking now dead last in the continental U.S. in retail pharmacy access. Hundreds of pharmacies have shuttered over the last 10 years, and the local-based retail pharmacy industry is pretty much non-existent. The main reasons, according to most and those in the legislature, has to do with what are called pharmacy benefits managers. Now, House Bill 3212 would rein in pharmacy benefit management abuse by requiring fair and transparent contracts. It would also prohibit a common if you will, tactic by pharmacy benefits managers to actually steer patients who need pharmaceuticals to the pharmacies of the PBM's choice, which many of them they own, which takes away not only choice for consumers, but also guts local access. And the bill would also ensure that pharmacists are no longer under a gag order imposed by PBMs from telling patients and employers the truth about cheaper alternatives and also coverage gaps. As you would figure, PBMs are fighting the bill. So, if you've been following the news, you may have heard something surprising, and that is that California Governor Gavin Newsom announced this week that he plans or wants to limit state-funded health care benefits for undocumented adults, including freezing enrollment in the Medi-Cal program, which is kind of like the Oregon Health Plan in California. And he also wants to start charging monthly premiums to those already enrolled in the program. That proposal aims to address a budget shortfall, and it's estimated could save California $3 billion. Now let's compare and contrast with Oregon. Right now in the Oregon legislature, Oregon lawmakers are voting on a plan to expand food stamps paid for by Oregon taxpayers to non-U.S. citizens. That would be Senate Bill 611. It would offer special tuition benefits to non-citizens. That's House Bill 2586, which of course would again be paid for by Oregon taxpayers, and would offer free government breakfasts and lunches to all K through 12 students in Oregon, regardless of need. That's House Bill 3435. Also, a bill that would make it illegal for Oregon landlords to ask about or discriminate based on a tenant's immigration status is a step closer to becoming law. The legislation would provide landlords from rejecting rental applicants because, well, they're not legal citizens. Supporters of the bill says it will safeguard vulnerable renters who may face discrimination or threats of deportation for reporting problems with their living situation. Senator Wimsby Campos is the chief sponsor of the bill. He said it's about ensuring that every Oregonian has the opportunity to find safe, stable housing without being subjected to fear or discrimination because of where they were born. It would also expand the range of ID documents that landlords would have to accept to verify identity. And they include things like Social Security cards, simple evidence of a Social Security number, a birth certificate, a green card, a non-immigrant visa, a taxpayer ID number or card, a passport, or a driver's license or other government ID. Keep in mind, in Oregon, legally, you can get a driver's license without being here in the country legally. And if the landlord requires ID verification, they have to accept any or a combination of any of those documents to confirm a person's name, date of birth, and physical appearance. The bill would also bar landlords from disclosing or threatening to disclose a tenant's immigration status, and the violation would carry legal penalties under Oregon landlord, tenant, and civil rights laws. So let's say a landlord did that, and they told somebody, yeah, I'm renting to somebody that's in the country illegally. Well, Senate Bill 599 would create a penalty of, at a minimum, $100,000 fine just for doing that. By the way, it should be mentioned that Shemia Fagan, who was found culpable by the Oregon Government Ethics Commission, remember, she was accepting money from the owners of a pot chain here in Oregon that owed over $10 million in state and federal taxes to the government, that were also giving out political donations in brown paper bags filled with cash, and which gave former Secretary of State Shemia Fagan a $10,000 a month consulting job while she was Secretary of State. They were going to fine her $1,600, and they said, the board did, that's too low. They charged her $3,600. This look at Oregon crazy news brought to you by Sean Sutherland, who's absolutely nothing like Superman, but he has answers. So when you have the questions, ask insurance. All right, Rick, time for you to get real.